I've been around about 10 years, and I'm going to introduce a guy here in a minute who's been around a lot longer than that, but he still looks like he's about 16 years old, right? You're a young looking man. The museum has, this was Bob's vision. It's Bob Pond's legacy. We've continued to grow it, and we've continued to add more aircraft. We're going to do something interesting tonight, and that is we're going to, about 7:30, run up the P-63 in the back there. We're going to shut off the tarmac lights, keep the lights on inside the tarmac, but you'll actually be able to see the flame coming out of that thing, and we'll do a run up here at the end of the event. I recognize a lot of you who've been coming to the Price of Freedom series. For those of you who are visiting us again, and our guests or members, thank you very much. We cannot do this without you. This is contrary to what anybody says, this is a tough business. You are part of the family. We are a living history museum, and we wouldn't be able to do it without you, our members and our guests that come and see us and see what we're doing and learn about everything here. Now there's another group that I recognize, and that is a lot of our docents and volunteers. Welcome as well. How many, raise your hand if you're a docent or a volunteer. A lot of our docents. Now, quite honestly, I make sure that the coffee is hot and the ice is cold, and Bill Hughes, who heads up the volunteers, and the docents, they are really what makes this place happen. And we are very grateful for our docents. As I said, we are a living history museum. We live aviation through them. And so to our docents this evening, thank you very much. We appreciate all the work you do. You run the museum. Now, I will introduce a guy that I'm going to date myself here. When I met him, and I'm an aviation geek, right? I was like in knee pants. I was, reading air classics when in the 1980s, I was this little kid. And there was this guy, Stan Stokes, and I would see his paintings, and I go, oh, his paintings are like so cool, And then one day, he goes, hi, I'm Stan Stokes, nice to meet you. And it was kind of like meeting Mick Jagger, I kind of wet my pants. Because I'm like, you're Stan Stokes? Keith Richards. No, you don't look like Keith Richards. Keith Richards is dead, and he's been dead for 15 years. He just doesn't know it yet. He's proof that living through chemicals is possible. But seriously, I knew of Stan Stokes, but I didn't really know him, and I got to have gotten to know him, and what a sweetheart of a guy, and he is, along with the docents, we call Stokes under glass. He has this little enclave over here and everything, but he is also part of the museum, and he's one of the reasons why this museum is a living history museum and so unique. And if it weren't for Stan and his interest and what he's going to tell you tonight about these airplanes and how things came along, because he really is the bod of the Air Museum now. He's the living history guy. Is it? Well, hopefully your shoulders can support the large cranium I'm creating for you. But you're going to hear from what is truly a living legend, one of the great American artists, and really is one of the great American artists. We auctioned off something the other night, and I'll leave you with this so your head doesn't get too big, but he agreed to do a sitting for the Diabetes Association, which we auctioned off, the commission painting. And I said, can you imagine if Michelangelo had taken time out, from doing the chapel and said, come on over for $100, I'll let you, do this or whatever, at some auction that the Pope was giving. That's kind of the equivalent of, Stan Stokes doing that. I mean, it would be, people don't have any idea how talented you are. And so with that, we appreciate what you do. We thank you for your time. And ladies and gentlemen, Stan Stokes.
After Bob passed away, I started thinking about it, and with the exception of the Pond family, I'm pretty much the senior person here. My whole thing with Bob started, I had just moved down here about 4 months beforehand from Napa, moving down to Palm Desert, and it was in a gallery over in Palm Desert, and they gave me a call and said, we have a couple that would like to meet you and commission a couple of paintings tomorrow. I said, oh, really? And what's their names? Well, it's Bob and Joe Pond. And because I'm an airplane nut, the name started ringing bells, and I went and looked through a couple of magazines, and there was a couple of pictures of Bob's P-40 and the P-51 at the Sun and Fun fly-in. And I went, I hope it's the same Bob Pond, you know, you never know. So anyway, I go into the gallery at the prescribed time the following day, and a few minutes later, in comes Bob and Joe Pond, and I had no idea how my life had just changed completely. Bob was telling me about the Mustang and the P-40, and that he just purchased them earlier that year, and he really had the bug. And he wanted me to do a painting of both of the airplanes with both of them in the airplanes. And I think it's the Mustang painting. It's just around the corner there, and I kind of look at it and kind of go, oh my God, I could do so much better. But that is my legacy. I have to embrace my legacy and realize that that was a long time ago. So we had the conversation, and at the end of the conversation, Bob said, oh, by the way, Stanley, what are you doing tomorrow? What do you have in mind? And he said, well, I just purchased this TBM Avenger. He said, do you know what that is? I said, oh yeah, I know what they are. I bought it from this Englishman, Stephen Gray. He's just decided he only wants fighters. And it's half restored. It's up in Salinas right now. He painted half of the Royal Navy paint scheme on it. And I need you to help me finish the paint job on it. So I said, well, I'll get my stuff together, and, you know, where should I meet you tomorrow? He said, well, our plane will be at Coombs Gates. So I got my stack of stuff, it was before Post-it notes, so little scraps of paper in there. And I show up at Coombs Gates, and at that time in life, I'm expecting, okay, maybe we're going to fly up to Salinas in maybe a Baron or something like that. So the Ponds show up, and Bob said, okay, follow me, and we go out. And we walk up to a Sabreliner, a jet. And I'm like, okay, this is fine. So get on board the jet. We flew up to King City. There was a couple named the Plaskett's, Barbara and Gordon Plaskett. They had been restoring the TBM. We picked them up, flew over to Salinas, went into this hangar. Here's this big, glorious TBM Avenger. And I start showing Bob what we can do and everything. He said, fine, Stanley, let's just do that. You're in charge now. And I'm kind of like, oh my God. So we pile back into the Sabreliner to King City, and from Salinas to King City and the jet just. And at that point, Bob was hungry, so we went to a little cafe and had lunch, and everybody had hamburgers and fries and everything. And we go back out to the airport, say goodbye to the Plasketts. As we're getting on board the jet, Bob turns to me and said, Stanley, you're a pilot, aren't you? And I said, well, yeah. And he said, well, you go up front and you fly the Sabreliner with Kermit. And I'm single engine land. And he said, shh. So he needed a nap really bad, so he went back and was immediately asleep like only Bob Pond could do. I'm sitting down in the right seat of the Sabreliner, and Kermit gives me this look like, who are you? And I said, Bob told me to come up here and fly the airplane with you. And he said, well, are you rated? And I said, I'm single engine land. And he said, just keep the seat warm. So I got to be co-pilot in the Sabreliner all the way back to Palm Springs. And that very same scenario happened so many times after that. And Kermit just got to where it was like, oh, it's you again. And I actually got to know Kermit really well, and he was fine with it all. The legalities of it, I have a tendency to think probably weren't quite what they should be. Anyway, so that was my intro to the world of Pond. We flew back down, and through some correspondence, I got the paint job, the size of the roundels worked out and everything. And that's how our TBM wound up in the Royal Navy paint scheme. A little while after that, when the whole thing was finished, was earlier in the spring of '82, Bob called and said, well, now Stanley, we're all back in Minnesota, and Steve Hinton is going to be delivering the TBM, and we want you to come along. So I got my stuff together and came out to the airport and piled into the TBM and got to fly in the turret at the TBM all the way to Minnesota, overnighting in Albuquerque. But I can remember going over the Arizona meteor crater, sitting in the Avenger's turret and kind of going, wow, look at that. As we went over it. We get back there, and the next day, Bob has all the local warbirds there, and suddenly we're flying in all these warbirds, and you know, this was like I had gone to heaven. Here I was. That day I had another ride in the TBM, but with the Mustang and the P40 off our wing, and then I had a ride later in the day in the TBM with the others, and there were 2 other Mustangs that were based out of there. That was Flying Cloud Field. Bob had the bug really, really bad at that point. So Bob starts looking for other airplanes. And Bob being Bob, if any of you know him well, like Fritz and everything, Bob would lie in wait for somebody with an airplane that he really, really liked, for that person to get a little bit tight with money. And then Bob would pounce. And whatever the person was asking, he'd pull out significantly less and kind of wave it under their nose and buy the airplane. Because he had a good sense of who really, really needed the money. So he got really good deals on a lot of these airplanes. But anyway, the very first warbird Bob had was this P-40 Warhawk. A fellow named Chuck Doyle actually on Johnny Cake Road in Apple Valley, Minnesota. The second I heard that address, I have never forgotten it. Who else, how many people have an address on Johnny Cake Road in Apple Valley, Minnesota? Bob was reading Trade a Plane. He saw the ad for the P-40. He went down to talk to Chuck. Chuck was a person all on his own. He was quite eccentric. Every airplane he had at some point was painted kind of a light turquoise, very ugly color. But it's because he worked for an airline for a long time out of Minnesota that was painted in those colors. And I think the colors that airline was painted is why the airline failed. Nobody would want to fly in airplanes that were painted that color. Anyway, Chuck had a Stearman, a Super Stearman, painted in light blue. Bob checked out the P-40, he took it for a flight, came back in, and really liked it. So he wrote out the check to Chuck and flew the P-40 back up. And the reason why Chuck had the P-40 is Chuck had found the sole surviving P-35 Seversky, a mid-30s designed airplane for the Army. And there is one other over in, I think it's the Netherlands, but the one that he had found in a barn and the one in the Netherlands are the only ones left. He restored it, and once the Air Force Museum found out that he had it, they wanted it really, really, really bad. So they traded the P-40 for that Seversky. So if you go to the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, when you see the P-35, that's what brought us P-40. Bob and Josie the next week flew this P-40 all over the place, all over the skies of Minneapolis, had just a blast. Chuck was brokering a P-51 Mustang, so Bob had so much fun in the P-40 the next week he went back down to Chuck's place and bought the Mustang. So he's now had 2 of them. And the Mustang previously had been a Cavalier converted Mustang. Before that, it had been an RCAF Mustang. It had gone through a lot of hands, but the most significant thing was the Cavalier part of the whole thing, because Cavalier was a company, I don't remember quite, it was out of Florida. Anyway, they would take P-51 Mustangs and they would do a conversion on them. That is Bob's P-51 before he had it painted. They would plush out the interior to about 1970 Cadillac standards. So today you'd look at it and go, ugh. But back then it looked pretty neat. It had an air conditioner in it, which was good for Bob. It had a 14-inch taller tail on it for a little bit of added stability. And it had that paint job, because at that time everybody was doing civvy paint jobs on things instead of military. But Bob wanted to get that military feel. So there was this book out on Air Force stuff, Army Air Corps, and somebody had done some color plates using a whole lot of imagination on the colors. But there was this really nice plate with this Mustang with a yellow nose and blue upper surfaces and invasion stripes. It was a bunch of baloney, but Bob liked it. So that's why our Mustang until 2 years ago was painted that way. Do you have the slide of how it was until recently? There it is. That was authentic, except all the blue should be olive drab. That squadron never had blue. But it looked good, and Bob always said, Stanley, make him look pretty. So, you know, I didn't have anything to do with that one, but I did have so many flights in that airplane that I have no idea how many times I rode in that airplane. Anyway, so Bob got the airplane painted, and in the process of having it painted, somebody talked him into bondoing the whole fuselage. And we always thought that maybe there were some dents in the fuselage or something that needed to be covered up with Bondo. Just the last couple of weeks, the Mustang has gone off to Chino for a complete restoration. And the first thing they did was strip the Bondo off. And the fuselage is great. There's nothing wrong with it. So when the Mustang comes back here, it's going to be polished aluminum. It's going to look so good. And I'm going to have to repaint the Tuskegee stuff on it, but that's fine. So that's as it was until just a few weeks ago. So it will be that again, only with a nice, shiny, polished aluminum fuselage. Going back to Bob a little bit, Bob grew up in Minneapolis. His mom's name was Dottie, his dad's name was Harold, and he had a sister, Barbara. And they weren't into aviation at all, but his dad had a little company where they installed terrazzo floors. It was called Advanced Machine Company. They had these machines to install terrazzo floors. Bob, in World War II, went off to the Navy. He was able to get into flying immediately because earlier in high school, he'd gone to Shattuck Military Academy in Minneapolis. While he was in Shattuck, he got to know quite a few different characters. One of his buddies was Peter Graves, who at that point was Peter Arness. And they stayed good friends all through their lives up until the very end, Peter going a little bit before Bob. Another buddy, as Bob put it, there were these showers, and behind the showers there was this room that had all the piping, the steam pipes and everything in it, and you could go back there and smoke and nobody would figure out you were back there smoking. Until one day, he and his buddy were back there and they got busted. His buddy that he got busted smoking with, where they both got suspended for a while, was Marlon Brando. So Marlon Brando was his high school smoking buddy. But because it was a military school and everything, that paved the way. Bob had a job at Dillard's department store in the necktie department. He very quickly got to know this other fellow, Art Ward. And Bob and Art stayed to be really close friends for the rest of their lives too. Art is very significant a little bit later on. They both went to the Navy together. Bob wound up, they both became naval aviators, but Bob wound up flying target tugs in Florida. He was always a little bit embarrassed that everybody went overseas, but he would tell it by saying, well, other guys were being shot at by the enemy, but I was being shot at by our own guys every day. So he was flying JM Marauders, the B-26 Marauder, but the short wing version, referred to as the Widowmaker, because a lot of them crashed. Painted a very, very bright yellow, and they would get in the air and put a sleeve out behind them, and then all the gunnery cadets would go bam, 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 trying to hit the sleeve and not the airplane. So Bob survives all that. The war ends, Bob goes back to Minnesota. Bob becomes the 8th employee working for his dad at Advanced Machine Company, which was still out of the garage. They're installing the terrazzo floors. Bob works out this machine that can grind the rocks down smooth much quicker, so they're able to install the terrazzo floors a lot quicker. Pretty soon the customers are calling him and saying, well, how do we clean these floors now? So Bob came up with a machine that could scrub the floors and do it really, really quick. He kept improving on that. Eventually it became the Convert-O-Matic for Advanced Machine Company, and they sold a couple of gazillion of those, I think, worldwide. I think the Air Museum a long time ago had one here. I know they still have a couple of advanced machines here. The floor scrubber that goes around, they ride on here, that's an advanced machine. Anyway, that was the start of the whole thing. Pretty soon they were no longer installing the floors because all they needed to do was clean the floors, sell the machines to clean the floors. And that wound up being a worldwide thing. Eventually Bob would have a facility in Wales and another facility in Japan. So it really was a worldwide business. By the time Bob sold the company, they had 120 different models of floor scrubbers, polishers, and sweepers. And the thing that kind of delighted me when I first went to advanced machine with Bob showing me and everything, it was on Lake Minnetonka. Everything Bob pawned was centered around Lake Minnetonka. But the factory was in Spring Park, Minnesota. Right behind it were railroad tracks, and there was another building right behind that. That other building was Tonka toys. I had spent my entire childhood playing Tonka toys. And here's Tonka, and on Lake Minnetonka. Eventually, it outgrew that, and Bob had some run-ins with the local EPA people because they were right on the lake. So Bob moved the company to Plymouth, Minnesota, and it became even bigger. The last I knew before Bob sold it, there were 800 employees there. And everywhere we would go around there, whether we were in the boat on Lake Minnetonka or driving around or whatever, you'd hear this constant, "Hi, Mr. Pond, hi, Mr. Pond." Everybody there knew him because they all worked for him. But anyway, back to the airplanes. So we have the P-40, the P-51, the TBM. The TBM survived because it was a mosquito sprayer. Back in the early 80s when I first was dealing with the TBM, you could go to the rear door and open it up and just the fumes would come out. Now I got to ride in it back there quite a few times. And a mosquito wouldn't come near you for quite a while. And there were a few times when I was painting big things back there, and I would be inundated with mosquitoes. One night I'm sitting there trying to draw a thing out, the hangar doors are open, and I'm just going, and after about an hour I look down and I have this little ring of mosquitoes around me, dead. I changed my location, went over to the TBM, opened up the door, and didn't have a mosquito problem the rest of the night. Anyway, that's why this airplane survived. These airplanes survived because the things like TBM and the bombers, they all had a good reason, a good life that kept them going after the military. The P-40, the Mustang, those airplanes survived just because somebody loved them enough to keep them instead of making frying pans out of them. And when a lot of these airplanes would get finished with their useful life, it just happened to coincide with the time that they started becoming collectible, so that saved them. And for quite a while, there was a good movie business with the airplanes. Now it's all computer-generated stuff, but back then they were used a lot. So anyway, I believe the next airplane to come along was the Corsair, and that was, it came from the CAF. There was a fellow named John Stokes, who I don't think was any relation to me. I've never seen that it was, but he was a big CAF guy. Bob was getting pulled by the CAF. I can remember when I first got him, he still had his CAF uniform and everything, and there was CAF stuff on the airplanes for a while. Bob started getting disillusioned with them for various reasons, and I think part of that is his collection was growing. They were wanting his airplanes. No, they're my airplanes. So he kept them and kept his whole thing growing there and everything. But his Corsair, before he had it, when John Stokes owned it, was one of the airplanes in the Black Sheep TV series a lot. And if you ever watch that, John Stokes had that painted up as a Bunker Hill Corsair. So a yellow nose, arrows on the tail, and an arrow on the top of the wing. They painted all that off for the movie, for the TV series, except they never bothered to paint the arrow off the top of the wing. So if you're watching Black Sheep Squadron, if you keep a real good eye out on the thing, every once in a while they'll be banking, and you can see that arrow, and you go, oh, there's our Corsair. Right? Previously, that Corsair had a useful life down in El Salvador. And in 1969, it was a participant in the soccer war. Most people have forgotten what that was about. Honduras and El Salvador did not like the outcome of a World Cup soccer meet, so of course they start shooting at one another. Both sides had Corsairs and Mustangs that we had given them, so there was Corsairs and Mustangs shooting down Corsairs and Mustangs. Most of them being flown by American mercenaries. So our Corsair was involved with all that. And you can look on the landing gear, one of the landing gear doors, there's a bullet hole in it, and that's from the soccer war. So anyway, the Corsair had a fairly colorful history. Bob gets it, and Steve Hinton restores it. Didn't do a whole lot to it. Didn't go completely through it, just kind of repainted it and everything. And then one fateful day, Kermit LaQuay, who I inadvertently flew the Saberliner with, he was taking off from Crystal Airport, and just as he was lifting off, the engine started detonating. And Crystal's surrounded by houses, and he thought, I'd better just keep this airplane on the ground. So he plopped the wheels back down, tried to shut down things as fast as he could, ran out of runway, and it went up on its nose. And everybody said it just balanced on its nose for the longest time. And then, of course, went over on its back and pinned Kermit in there for a little bit and everything. Steve Hinton guys came out, disassembled it, took it into Chino and completely restored it. That's when they put the back seat in it and the real dark blue windows back there. And I've actually ridden in it, and it's a lot more roomy back there than the back seat of the Mustang. So, the next one to come along was the B-25. And the B-25 has kind of the world of aviation is very, very small and interconnected. It was a firefighter before Bob ever had it, and it sat out of Chino for quite a while in between time. But while it was a firefighter, it spent a lot of time up in Alaska, and it was owned by Dan Gilbertson's dad. So our Dan Gilbertson actually rode around in our B-25 when he was a kid, because he'd ride along with his dad during the firebombing. And at one point, they were actually down here at Palm Springs fighting fires with that bomber and everything. So very small world with the whole thing. Some people don't know it, but our B-25 was used in the movie Pearl Harbor, and it actually did 2 carrier takeoffs for the movie. So if you ever watch Pearl Harbor again, if you can stand to watch that movie again, when you see the carrier takeoffs, 2 of those are our B-25. And the last real scene of the B-25s is they're heading towards China and the setting sun and everything. The one up real close, the RP-40 was also in Pearl Harbor. Ben Affleck was supposedly the pilot of ours. And Steve Hinton was in charge of the whole thing. And Steve almost came to blows with Ben Affleck to the point where it actually made a sidebar in Newsweek magazine about their almost confrontation. Because Ben Affleck was kind of abusing the P-40 and Steve told him to stop it. So at that point, Bob had made good friends with a fellow named Dick Parker here, and had found out that Dick Parker was a P-47 pilot. So Bob got the bug for a P-47. So that's how our P-47 happened. And it's in Dick Parker's colors. Dick Parker grew famous by crashing 5 or 6 P-47s. So everybody always referred to him 7. Dave's saying 7. Anyway, everybody referred to him as a Luftwaffe ace because of that. But he lived right here. Nice guy, and he passed away 10 years ago. Then after acquiring the P-47 and Steve Hinton restoring it and getting everything up, everything was happening really, really fast in the acquisition of the airplanes. Bob got his first A-26 Invader. It had been a fire bomber. It was the silver one with the big blue tail on it and everything. It's not this particular one. For a while, Bob had 2 of them. But we flew that airplane everywhere. At one point, Bob said, Stanley, we've got another trip. So we piled into the Invader and flew it down to Harlingen, Texas. And what Bob was looking at was this hulk of stuff that was supposed to be a P-63 King Cobra. And the CAF had that in excess because they already had one all restored, and they had another one. So they didn't need a third one that needed a complete restoration. So I think Bob got it for a pretty good price there. But that is our King Cobra. And in regards to our King Cobra, it's pretty Polly. And Polly is Bob's daughter. So she grew up as Polly Pond. And when she married, she became Polly Holly. So she went from Polly Pond to Polly Holly. She's a really nice person. So anyway, that's pretty Polly. Bob acquired the SNJ over there, had it painted up in Minneapolis colors. Our Wildcat, which is actually an FM2 Wildcat, a GM-built Wildcat. Bob didn't ever fly the Navy fighters that much. Bob, even though he had been a Navy pilot was more comfortable in a tricycle geared airplane or an airplane that you could wheel land like a Mustang. The Navy airplanes were meant to land 3-point so that their tail would be low so the hook would get the wire and everything. And Bob never really warmed up to that. So with the Navy fighters, Bob would make a couple of flights in them and then just kind of leave them be for other people to fly. He was perfectly happy. When the Hellcat came along, I can really remember Steve calling up Bob saying, fly over tomorrow morning to Chino and be there over Chino at whatever time it was. It was just after sunup and everything. So Bob called me up and said, Stanley, be here, you know, whenever that was. So I get out here, I'm not really awake or anything, and I pile into the back seat of the Baron. And we're flying over there, and Steve asks Bob where he is, and Bob tells him. A couple of minutes later, the Hellcat pulls right up alongside us. And you could not imagine what a thrilling sight that was. Steve did that with a couple of airplanes. But to have something like an F6F Hellcat just out of nowhere pull up right alongside you with the golden hour light on it and everything, just still gives me chills on the whole thing. One unfortunate thing with the Hellcat was it's about the 4th time that Bob flew it. It was at Chino during the air show, and on Saturday evening he went up for a photo hop. Mike DiMarino was in the Chino Hellcat. There were some photographers in the B-25 and a few other airplanes. Bob, now remembering that he likes to wheel land airplanes and not 3-point them, he's coming in to land, he touches down, and he's rolling out tail high and everything. He thinks that Mike DiMarino is real close behind him in the other Hellcat, so he guns it a little bit. And just as he did that, the left brake locked up. And the Hellcat just skidded right off the runway, right across a little stretch of dirt, hit an irrigation ditch, went up on its nose, and then went down on its back. And the tail just happened to hit a manure spreader, and it split the tail like that, which absorbed all the impact of it going over and everything. But I was about the 5th or 6th person out there. The wheels were still rolling, and some of the fluids were coming out of the airplane, and Bob was still trying to get out of the cockpit. So we got him out of the cockpit. He was a little scraped up and everything. But the interesting thing about this is, I mean, Bob was one of those that would get right back on the horse and continue on. Steve was looking at this as an airplane he had just finished restoring, and now here it was fairly badly damaged. Steve had it flying a month later. And part of that was that Steve and the Chino kids knew of 4 Hellcats that in 1945 crashed into the backside of Mount Baldy. And they were able to go within about a 2-hour hike with 4-wheel drive stuff up there, and for 2 hours carried all the tools on their back. And in one afternoon they were able to get a tail off of one of the crashed airplanes and everything else they needed and load it up and bring it back. So our Hellcat actually has a tail off a Hellcat that crashed into the backside of Mount Baldy. But that made it to where a month later, the Hellcat was there ready to go to Oshkosh, because it was always the big push to get everything to Oshkosh. One year we had 7 of Bob's airplanes all go to Oshkosh. And it was a daily thing, back and forth. And one day I got to go in the B-25, and you'd go in a solid pack of airplanes with a few of the other Minneapolis-based airplanes along, so it'd be this whole. And the very first time I went to Oshkosh was in the B-25, and that was my first time at Oshkosh. And I always thought, if I ever go to Oshkosh, I want to have a grand entrance. So I got to be in the nose of the B-25 as we were landing at Oshkosh, and later that day I was in the nose of it. During the air show with 3 other B-25s and some B-17s and Mustangs doing S-trains over our heads, and flying along in front of the thousands of people with pyrotechnics going off and everything. And I'm just thinking, I've done something right. To have this, I am being blessed beyond my wildest imagination. So going down the list of airplanes here, Bob acquired the F-7F Tiger Cat. And the Tiger Cat had survived because it had been an aerial tanker. It had flown with a company in Northern California called CalNet, and then another one called Siskiyou Aviation in 1972, I think it was. It had a crash landing in Ukiah, but that's when it was flying with CalNet. That is our Tiger Cat. So it survived by fighting fires. Back in that time, I watched them fighting fires all the time, and I probably saw our Tiger Cat fighting fires. So Bob gets that, and Bob flew it some. He liked it because it was a tricycle plane, and it was a little bit more friendly for him to fly and everything. At one point, we had a P-38 Lightning, but the way that happened, the Planes of Fame Chino had this P-38. They didn't want to really let go of the whole thing, so Bob worked out a lease program with them. So they would restore it, and from the time they got it restored, 10 years, Bob and Josie would have it, and then they would have to give it back. So it is now 23 Skidoo over at Chino. But that is it, and it's restored. Steve Hinton flies it back to Minnesota, once again for Oshkosh. I'm there. As he's taxiing in, the ponds are there, everybody else is there looking at this great P-38. And Josie's wearing this jacket on the back of it, it's embroidered, Jolt and Josie, the Pacific Pioneer, which was actually a B-29. And both of them looked at me and said, "You gotta paint that on the nose by tomorrow morning." So I spent the night painting the Jolt and Josie on there. Steve was prepping to go to Oshkosh the next day. So we're talking, trying not to fall asleep while we're doing our work and everything. And I'm telling Steve, I used to plane a couple of P-38s at Brackett Airport when I was a kid. There were no security people, there were no attorneys. So a kid could go out there and play on the airplanes, and if you got hurt, you just had to limp home. It's just kind of the way it was. So I climbed all over those. The wheel struts were flat, the tires were flat, the plexiglass was all yellowed and crazed. You had to look out for black widows in there and everything. So I'm telling Steve about this. I said, "Whatever happened to those?" He said, "You're painting on one of them." It was the very same airplane. I grew up playing on that airplane. So my first time with that airplane, I was probably about 7 or 8 years old. And right along with that, probably the first time I crossed paths with Steve Hinton, because I used to bicycle up to their original compound, you wouldn't even call it a museum, off of Highway 66 in Claremont, what later would become Plains of Fame. And there were these pesky kids running around. I was also a pesky kid, but I was slightly older than them. And so I probably crossed paths with Steve when I was 10 and he was about 7. So I'll go way back with all this. So anyway, that was our P-38. They'd sure like to have it back, but they want a whole lot of money for it now. So our Bearcat came along, and our Bearcat survived because Grumman built it for themselves. It had been the tech rep airplane for Grumman. I have photos of it as the chase plane for F-11F Tigers and other aircraft like that. After they finished with it, Cornell University acquired it. After Cornell University was finished with it, Corky Fornoff had it. His dad, Bill Fornoff, also had a Bearcat, and they would do twin aerobatic routines. His dad crashed in his, wing came off. But anyway, that's them back then. Ours is the one in the back, and that is our Bearcat. Once Corky Fornoff was done with it, it changed hands a few times, but eventually it wound up with Bob owning it. And everybody that's flown us at that airplane is such a hot rod, you can't believe it. Okay, the next thing is our Spitfire, our Mark 14 Spitfire. Our Mark 14, for the longest time, was over in England. It was painted in a scarlet paint job with white trim, and its registration number was G-Fire. And I used to see that in all the magazines and just kind of go, that was the neatest looking airplane. There it is back then. You can't, well, on the tails where it says the G-Fire. Bob called me up one day and said, "Stanley, I've just bought a Spitfire." I went, "Oh my God, Bob, what?" And he proceeded to tell me, and he said, "Have you ever seen one called G-Fire?" I said, "Sure, I have." He said, "That's the one." So it was brought over here. Now, there's been a lot of people talking about the paint job on it over the years and why the invasion stripes. I mean, it's right there. Those aren't invasion stripes. It was number 80 Squadron at Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong. It was one of the last Spitfire squadrons in the RAF, and that was 1951. There actually is a photo of that squadron. So the only thing is, Bob always wanted glossy colors instead of flat colors. If you took our Spitfire and put a coat of dull coat on it, and then threw dirt all over it and scraped on it a little bit, it would look like that. But that Spitfire is powerful enough, it could literally go straight up on takeoff. The only thing is, in my entire time with the pond collection and everything, I have yet to see that airplane fly. It's always had a problem here and there. So I've always, back when Bob was alive, I always kidded him, it doesn't fly. Oh, yes, it does, John. Oh, it doesn't fly. I've never seen it fly. I've seen them all fly, and I've never seen it fly. So they just kind of, go away. There was a time when Bob was acquiring more Mustangs because he loved Mustangs, and he had a second one that was called Mighty Moose. You would think, okay, that's because of Minnesota. Indirectly, yes, but Bob also had a house down at Lighthouse Point in Pompano Beach, Florida, and he had 3 yachts, Mr. Moose, Mighty Moose, and Mini Moose. So the Mustang was actually named after Mighty Moose, the biggest of the yachts and everything. I only flew in it a couple of times. Bob didn't have it all that long, and I frankly don't remember where it went after Bob. There was a Yak, a trainer. It was painted up in Russian colors. And there was a DC-3 before our DC-3, and it was actually a C-53. So it was a passenger plane built for the Army Air Corps. So it had a passenger door instead of the cargo door. But they had done some upgrading on it. It actually had landing gear fairings that would cover in the wheels, even though the wheels stick out about 10 feet below the airplane. So these big ungainly clamshell things would cover the wheels. You'd go, that's the stupidest thing I've ever seen. When Bob first got it, it also had big spinners covering the prop hubs, which made it even look worse. But the thing that really, really made it look bad, he bought it off a fried chicken company restaurant from the South, and it had these big, giant rooster heads on the tail. And it looked ridiculous. And, it was about 1965 colors on the thing. So Bob couldn't paint it fast enough. So he had all those, the other plane, he had the Douglas Sky Raider, which we all kind of thought was really, really neat. I went to Oshkosh once in the Sky Raider, and Ed Maloney was in the back of it with me. It was one of those 85s with the big canopy on it where you can pack a whole troop of people in the back of the thing. And the Sky Raider could lift however many people you'd cram it. You could take college kids that had just crammed themselves into a car and pack them into the back of the Sky Raider, and it would say, fine, it would take off. So Ed Maloney was back there with me, and we're going to Oshkosh. And at one point, the Wildcat pulls up, and the Hellcat pulls up, and I think the P-40 and the Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt, and they're all lined up like that. And I get my camera up, I'm just about to take a picture of it, and Ed Maloney stands up with his little tiny camera and is going click, 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 and I can't take the picture around him. And just as he sits back down and I get my camera back up, they all fly away. So that's the picture I never got. So we had all these other airplanes. Another really, really interesting one was an airplane called LEP. It was a Swiss airplane that was built with an inline engine on it. Somebody got the idea that they could re-engine the thing for the Swiss Air Force, and they put a turboprop on it. But for weight and balance, they had to put this little turboprop about 10 feet out there. So here's this airplane that looked okay, only you tacked on about a 10-foot nose on it with a little turboprop up there. And it made it look so ridiculous. And it was a tail dragger, but it was so ridiculous, Bob loved that airplane. Got it painted up in Luftwaffe colors. It had 3 tails on it, even though it was a little airplane. But the most ridiculous thing about it was the tail dragger with a turboprop engine. So every time you would start the engine up, if you were parked on grass, it would start the grass on fire. So you would have to have a fire bottle with you to put the grass out. If you were on asphalt, it would start bubbling the asphalt. So kind of not completely thought through. We go to an auction at Santa Monica, I think it was September of '91, and Bob's looking over everything, and they open the doors, and here's this B-17, big giant B-17 there. And Bob's kind of like, oh my God, I need that airplane. But they wanted a whole lot of money for it. It came from the Lone Star Museum. There was a Florida outfit that was involved, a whole bunch of different people involved. They had just restored it and they wanted money out of it. And Bob he wanted the airplane, but not for that much money. So the plane was not sold that night, and Bob dickered with them for well over a year. And after dickering for so long and everything, I think they really needed the money, but they couldn't quite come to terms with Bob on how Bob wanted to do it. So they worked out a deal where Bob's DC-3 and a Skyraider and a bucket full of cash went to buy our V-17, and that's our V-17. So that's how that came, at the cost of the DC-3 and the Skyraider, but I guess that's okay in the long run. Now, the last airplane I'm going to mention is the C-1 Trader, because this goes back to, remember Art Ward, who was in the necktie department of Dillard's with Bob, and they had become really, really, really good friends. They went in the Navy together. Later on, Bob goes, back into civilian life and builds Advanced Machine Company up into this huge thing. And Art stayed in the Navy for a while, wound up flying S2Fs and C-1 Traders, like that, and getting to be a little bit of a wheel of naval aviation. When he left the Navy and started his own business, he started A&R recording studios in Manhattan. And the smart thing he did is he bought the property, so Manhattan property. But A&R recording studios became a pretty big deal. Frank Sinatra recorded there, Michael Jackson recorded Thriller there, a lot of big time people recorded there. So Art was getting very well set in life as Bob was doing the same thing. They stayed very close, almost like brothers. Art was involved with the Naval Aviation Museum down at Pensacola, and Bob didn't know anything about it, but was kind of interested, and Art was saying, well, come on down, you gotta come down, you gotta meet everybody. So eventually he talked Bob into going down there, and they just sucked Bob right into the whole thing. So Bob got involved with the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, but to his benefit, he got to know who to talk to and everything else. So when this museum happened, our Navy jets that we have here, all the Navy stuff that the Navy still technically owns, that was all done through Art Ward. Bob Rasmussen, who's the director down there, has been for the last century. And just getting on their good side, knowing how the machinery worked and everything else, so that our jets out in front, that's all because of Bob's connection through Art Ward with the Naval Aviation Museum at Pensacola. Because Bob Rasmussen, the director down there, he's in charge of the acquisitions and the stuff they can trade off and everything else. So it's what he says goes down there. Now, Bob Rasmussen, way back, was a Blue Angel pilot. And in, I think it was Blue Angel 58 and 59, he flew F-11F Tigers. He's also an artist, he does watercolors, and if you're ever down there at the museum, you see these really well done bronzes and everything. He's the one that did those. So over and above being a naval aviator, he's a really good artist. But in 1959, Brackett Airport, where ultimately I would get my pilot's license, was opening up their new facilities. They had somehow managed to have the Blue Angels there. The Blue Angels could not land at Brackett Airport because the runways were too small, so they had to land in Ontario. So they were doing their air show from Ontario, flying over to Brackett, and then flying back to Ontario, getting in a helicopter and coming back, landing and shaking everybody's hands. And the first time I had a chance to really talk through things with Bob Rasmussen, he was one of the pilots that I watched in 1959, and I can remember the Blue Angel pilots walking down the row. We were all hanging on chain link fences. I was 9 years old, and these big 7'6" naval aviators, they're gods, walking by and shaking your hand, oh, like that. And in doing that, all of us were being infused with naval aviation. I mean, from that moment on, that's what I wanted to do. But I've always, when talking to Bob, I said, you remember that 9-year-old kid you shook the hand of? He said, oh, sure. There's about 1,000 of us. But anyway, that's my path crossing with Bob Rasmussen. But that's how we got all of our Navy airplanes, is through that. So everything, it's all interconnected in amazing ways. Let me see if I've missed anything here. I think I've got it all pretty much. One thing, our 826, this is the second one that Bob had. This one was also a firefighter, and its last real claim to fame was that was the star of the movie Always. And if you remember that movie, Holly Hunter, John Goodman, Richard Dreyfuss, and I can't remember her name, it was her last movie. Audrey Hepburn. Audrey Hepburn's last movie. But it's all about firefighters and everything. And at the tail end of the movie, Holly Hunter takes an A-26 for a joyride when she's not supposed to do it or anything, and kind of blows the doors off the little airport. That's our A-26 that was doing that in that movie. So for all you guys, Holly Hunter has climbed on that airplane. For all you ladies, Richard Dreyfuss climbed on it? Anyway, there's a lot of movie history with the airplanes. The Spitfire was in Ace's Iron Eagle 3, which if you've never seen the movie, don't bother, it was a horrible movie. But our airplane was still in it. They've been in a lot of movies, and anyway, I think I've covered everything I was supposed to cover here. One last thing. Angela, Miss Angela, painted on the side of the B-17. Angela is Josie's granddaughter. Bob and Josie raised Angela from the time she was about 7. She's the same age as my daughter Larissa, and the two of them kind of grew up as pals. Went to Europe with them in the Jetstar. The Jetstar was a whole different thing because it had really, really long legs, but for a jet it wasn't all that fast. And we went to an air show in Seyon, Switzerland, and when we took off, heading down towards Lake Geneva, the plane's just kind of slowly climbing, not like you would expect a jet, and we went by the Matterhorn, and we were still really looking up at the Matterhorn, and we were thinking, this isn't performing too well. So once we got back from that trip, Bob sold the Jetstar real quick. And that's when he bought a G2. The only problem with the G2, great performing airplane, but really, really, really loud. He had a whole series of things. At one point, he had a Piaggio Avante, which was a real high performance twin engine turboprop, very space age looking. And one kind of funny thing that happened with this airplane wound up being a very fast airplane. And Bob had, it was a real early one that he had. Do you remember Fritz Howard? It was like the 7th or 8th Piaggio Avante that they built. Yeah, Fritz is saying probably earlier than that. But everywhere you went in that thing, people would stop and look. And there's a couple of them that still fly out of here and will fly over our house and look into it from time to time. They sound like an Indianapolis race car when they're flying over. But Beach Aircraft had at Bermuda Dunes one day, and Bob called me and said, Stanley, we're going to go over there and look at Beechcraft stuff. Because Bob had always had a Baron, and he liked other Beechcraft. So we're over there, and they had a Starship. Now, when Burt Rutan designed the Starship, he built it very, very light. And by the time the FAA and Beech were done with the design, they had about doubled the weight of it and slowed the airplane down pathetically. So there's a Starship there, and the salesman that's standing out in front of it from Beech Aircraft, Bob knows the guy. And Bob comes up to me and says, Stanley, go over and ask the guy how much faster the Starship is than the Piaggio. So I kind of went up, and the guy said, oh, can I help you? And I'm just looking at the Starship and everything. And just say, how much faster is that than a Piaggio Avante? And the guy kind of looks down and he says, oh, it's 50 miles an hour slower. And the guy's kind of like, oh my God. And Bob's right behind me and starts busting up laughing, and pretty soon the guy sees him and recognizes him, and they all start laughing and everything. But Bob was always a little bit of a prankster like that. But that was kind of the end of a very long line of turboprops and jets and everything. The ones I liked the best were the Saberliners because they really moved and everything. They were old, but the basic design stemmed from the F-86 Sabre jet, and Bob always kind of fit that. Bob would fly it for the most part with Kermit back and forth, and it was an overpowered jet that could cruise at 45,000 feet. And I would ride in the jump seat, and you were flying over the tops of the vast majority of all the weather and everything, but you're 45,000 feet. And it wasn't until many years later that I found out that if we cracked a window or anything like that, we all would have been dead in about 20 seconds. So Bob would be there with an oxygen mask dangling down because somebody has to be doing that. But half the time he was up there with Kermit with the oxygen mask dangling down here, he was also sound asleep. So the sun coming in through the windows and all that, and you're 45,000 feet, and you'd look over, Bob's asleep. And Kermit would always look over at me and go, the whole cockpit was much mellower when Bob was asleep. So anyway, anybody have any questions?
Yeah, can you tell us about when Joe and him crashed that P-40 over there in Moreno Valley?
Well, Bob was here with the P-40, and he takes off after cutting the ribbon and everything, and does a flyby and everything, and then realizes he's got a landing gear problem. So he goes out and he's circling around to the east, and nobody realized what was going on. Harold Williamson was there with me, and he kind of was going, there's a problem, isn't there? Yep, there's a problem. So Harold went in and was actually able to get Bob on the radio. And Bob said, I've got a landing gear halfway down, and it won't go up or down. So I think we're going to head to Chino. At this point, the P-40 still had its belly tank on it, so Bob thought judiciously, maybe we should get all the fuel out of that belly tank. So he switched over. Josie was in the back seat of the thing. Interestingly, Bob had wanted me to go along. And this is one of two times when I had this overwhelming feeling of, no, you're going to stay on the ground. That little inner voice yelling at you saying, you're not going to go. So Josie went anyway. So they're heading towards Moreno Valley. Bob gets Steve Hinton on the radio and telling him about the little landing gear problem. And as Steve's talking to him, he's approaching March Air Force Base, so Bob gets March on the radio and says, I have a little problem, I'm heading to Chino, I need to pass through this area. Just as he's talking to them, the engine quits. Because he had been fiddling with landing gear to the point where he hadn't realized the belly tank was going dry. And those have an Allison V12 in them, and the one thing you don't do with an Allison V12 is restart it after it's quit and the engine is hot. So Bob said it took him about 20 seconds to realize that they were going to have to put the airplane down somewhere. And the best thing to do would put the one landing gear that was still operating up, because he was going to have to belly the thing in. He told Josie to cinch it up really, really good. They had only started wearing crash helmets about 2 weeks beforehand. Until then, they had just had caps on. So Josie, following the orders of Bob said, throw everything overboard that's going to be loose and could hurt us bouncing around. So Josie opened up, there was a little side door back then, window. She opens that up, she throws the camera out, throws her bracelet out, throws a whole bunch of other stuff out. There was people in Moreno Valley that were just going, it's Christmas. Except the camera just smashed itself to bits. Bob initially was going to set it down on Riverside Raceway because that's what March Field suggested. There were sports cars going around the whole thing. So he said, that's too dangerous. So he saw a field. He circled around over the field and set the thing down in the field, and was probably a little hotter than he was expecting on the speed. Went across the field, across Paris Boulevard, didn't hit any cars. There was a little berm on the other side that he hit, which knocked him into the air a little bit. He went underneath the power lines came back down and came to a stop just short of the back porch of a house. And he said that as all the dust cleared out and everything, well, here's the P-40 with the shark mouth and the eyes and everything. He said the rear, was a screen door flung open in the back porch to this house. And he said about 20 people came piling out of that house. He said their eyes were as big as they could possibly be. And they just stood there. They didn't know what to do, they just stood there. Bob keyed the mic, and Steve was still on the thing. So Bob quickly calls up March and tells them they're on the ground, they're okay, don't worry about it. Bob tells Steve that he's on the ground, they're okay. Steve said they figured out about where they were. We'll be right over. They're 20 minutes away over Chino. So Bob and Josie get out of the airplane, and they're standing there. One fire truck showed up, and one policeman showed up. And both the fire truck and the policeman, they're standing there going, what are we supposed to do? We don't know what we're supposed to do. Here's this P-40 Warhawk sitting there. P-40 was fine, it wasn't leaking anything or anything. And about a half hour into this whole thing, Steve Hinton and guys show up with a flatbed truck and a forklift. And within a half hour, they had that airplane disassembled enough to where it was on the back of that truck. And with the policeman standing there and the fireman standing there, they'll go, see ya, and drive off. The FAA has no record of that having happened. And that was a long time ago. So they get it over to Chino. Bob and Josie get a rental car and drive home. The only injury of that entire day was Bob's head got sunburned from standing out there. The Press Enterprise had one young lady show up and she wrote an article about it. And just about 2 months ago, I had saved that in my P-40 book all along. I handed it over to the archives for the museum here because I thought, yeah, they should have that. But the Ponds were having a party at their house and show up and ring the doorbell. And Bob and Josie both show up at the front door and go, shh, don't tell anybody. Nobody knows what happened today. Shh, don't tell anybody. So we just went in and nothing happened today. And hardly anybody ever knew that happened. And Steve had the P-40 back flying in about 3 or 4 months. So, no harm, no foul. Anybody else have a question? Well, he would have liked to have been able to hold on to the P-38 forever rather than have to give it back up and everything. And I think everybody here would really have liked to have it to where the P-38 was still here. But, that just wasn't able to happen. It made it to where we were around the P-38 for 10 years, and it was glorious. That next day, after I painted the Jolt and Josie on the nose, we went to Oshkosh. I was in the B-25. Steve Hinton was flying the P-38. And here I am with my cameras and everything, zipping from one side to the other and the tail and everything. And Steve's doing rolls around us with the P-38 and pulling up right alongside. And there's a little window, a round window that you can take out of the side of a B-25 that's made like a manhole cover, so you can't lose it. But that means you can photograph stuff with no plexiglass or anything. So I was able to get some really good shots there. And then I went into the tail of the B-25 and got my cameras ready and everything. And here I am sitting in the tail of the B-25, and this P-38 comes right up behind us like that, maybe 20 feet behind us. And then backs up a little bit and does a roll and all that sort of stuff. You can't have more fun than that. And the Yak was along on that flight. The only flight that could come close to that, there was a while, Bob was going to England a lot. They wound up buying a house just off Belgravia Square, a townhouse. And Bob had his Rolls Royces, of course. Everywhere Bob was, there'd be Rolls Royces. The Rolls Royces and Ferraris that Bob had in Minnesota, I think in the entire city of Minneapolis, his were the only ones. And it made him just stick out like you can't believe. But everybody would be, as you'd be driving around, everybody, hi, Mr. Pond, as you'd be going by. So they knew who it was and everything. And there was one time when a red Ferrari went by us, and Bob was astounded that there was another red Ferrari. So, as opposed to here where they're just all over the place and everything. But anyway, England, went to England several times with them. The good thing about that was riding in the jump seat across the North Atlantic at night, seeing the contrails and other things. On one of them, there was a C5 Galaxy about 15 miles ahead of us, and we were way out there in the middle of the North Atlantic. It's comforting to know there's something like a C5 Galaxy up ahead of you, and that you're talking with it, right? So we'd always fly into Luton, because Bob never liked waiting for anything. You could fly into Luton Airport, it was an international airport, and you could get in and out of there real quick, as opposed to Heathrow or something. The only thing was, when you landed on the runway, they had no taxiway, so you had to turn around and taxi back halfway down the runway and then turn off. But there were always really strange planes going in and out of there. On one of the flights, there was a big, short Belfast, this big British transport plane that I'd never seen before. So you always got to see new things, new fun things. But Bob joined forces with Stephen Gray for a little while on a B-25. It was an early model B-25. So Bob bought half of it. So we'd go over there and they'd fly it to air shows, along with all of Stephen's fighters. We flew up to Coventry. They'd already taken the warbirds up there, so we went in Bob's helicopter. And as we're approaching Coventry, we're circling around really low, kind of maneuvering around into where we're supposed to be in everything. And I look down, and there's this sea of Jaguars. And I'm just thinking to myself, everybody around here sure love Jaguars or something. And then I realized that was the Jaguar factory in Coventry. So, and I bet you any one of those cars, if you drove it for a week, it would have broken down with you. Because that's when Jaguars were that bad. Anyway, later on that day, after all the warbirds flew and everything, Bob said, "Stanley, get into the B-25." So we all piled into the B-25. We were going to escort the fighters back to Duxford, where Stephen Gray was based out of. So we take off in the B-25. This B-25 was an earlier one, and it was supposed to have a plexiglass cone on the back, but instead it had a little thing you could raise up there, and it was just air. You could just reach out there and you were behind the airplane. And you had to be on your belly because it was tight there, so you'd wrap your toes around the bulkhead like you've never wrapped your toes around anything before. You know, and make your elbows really strong and everything because it's outside. But as we're flying along, Steve Hinton comes up in Stephen Gray's Bearcat, and all of a sudden, all we have is Bearcat 15 feet behind us. And somewhere I have the photos where all you can see is radial engine with Bearcat wings. You can't even see the canopy. Then Nicky Gray pulled up behind us in Stephen's P-40 Warhawk, and I got some great shots of that. He didn't get quite so close, so I could actually get some decent photos of it. And then Kermit showed us in the helicopter. It was an Augusta 109 twin jet. And they had slowed the B-25 down enough so the helicopter was hanging in there really good. And I got some shots of Kermit right through the windshield of the helicopter, but I could actually hear the rotor blades going blah, 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 over the noise of the B-25. And then we land at Duxford, we all pile out of the B-25. We need to get back to London, get in the helicopter, and take off. Just as we're crossing over the Thames at maybe 3,000 feet, the sun's just about to go down. It's the most beautiful sight of London you've ever seen. The Tower Bridge, with the last rays of the sun hitting it, with these shadows going down the Thames. And just, you know, you couldn't pick a better thing to photograph, except I was out of film. So the photo of my life, I have it in my head, but not on film. Because I shot all the film at the air show. So anyway, anybody else?
Of all the planes, did any of them get assignment, you know, like into the theaters? I know that, well, at least the Spitfire, I hear shot down a B-1 or B-1 buzz bomb.
Well, they were capable of it, but I've never heard that this one actually did any fighting. And generally, the airplanes that got into combat didn't come back. This one being a British airplane, to tell you the truth, I don't really know, but I've never heard that, so I'm very suspicious that that would have happened, because I think that would have been a really big selling point back then. And I think Bob would have been telling everybody, and I never heard that. So I seriously doubt it. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention. Bob growing up in Minnesota, Bob growing up in snow, Bob being right at home in Minnesota like Minnesota's having right now. advanced machine company sponsoring ice hockey and all that sort of stuff. Somehow, the docents here have got the notion that Bob was one of the founders of Zamboni. I've heard that from more people here. Oh, wasn't Bob a key person in Zamboni? And Zamboni was Frank Zamboni in Paramount, California. Bob had absolutely nothing to do with Zamboni. If Bob could have, with the amount of that they've sold, he would have, but he wasn't. So, Dave?
Didn't Bob have kind of an experimental aircraft at one time?
Well, there was a pond racer, and that
Right.
kind of was a sad story, because it did wind up crashing. It was a very advanced unlimited race plane that had severe bugs in the whole thing, and most of the bugs were the engines. They were Nissan racing engines that would be turning at 12,000 RPMs and geared down, and there it is. And it was cowled so tightly that when they would shut the engines down, they immediately had to put fans in the air inlets before everything would start melting. But also because it was geared, as it was flying around, you'd hear this high-pitched sound that was kind of on top of a lawnmower sound. So it sounded like almost a jet put together with a lawnmower. But when it would shut down, it'd go, "Roop." There was no winding down or anything. It would just be a very abrupt thing. But it did wind up crashing. The pilot was killed, and that ended it for the air racing. But I've been around air racing a whole lot, and that's kind of the way a whole lot of racing ends. So Joan and I have not been to the Reno air races. We probably will never go to the Reno air races. Way back, I had enough of the Reno air races. So.
Could you mention anything about the cars he collected?
Well, Bob was a fiend on cars, even more than airplanes. Back in Minnesota, the Pond House back there, which was this big, huge Victorian house, he had added to the garages, so there was Ferraris and Rolls Royces. Some vintage, actually both vintage Ferraris and Rolls Royces. Bob never really bought the new ones. I think the first time Bob bought something new was when he bought the Maybach. But there was one day when I flew back there, and Bob and I had business at the Air Museum. I got up, we had breakfast, and we went to take one of the Pond cars, and got the keys for one of them, and we go out there, and he goes, "Okay, not that car. Go get the keys for another one." And that one was an old vintage Rolls. And as I'm about to get into it, I say, "Bob, there's a big pool of fluid underneath this car." So Bob looked down and said, "Okay, not that one." We went through all the cars. None of them worked that morning. So I don't remember how we got out to the Air Museum, but it wasn't with any of Bob's cars. And one of the summers I was back there painting one of the murals, they gave me the use of the Jaguar XJS Cabriolet. Great looking car. It was a hunk of... about every 3 or 4 days it would find a new way of breaking down. Very inventive. Half the time it was battery. For some reason it would lose the charge all the time. But I would go somewhere in it thinking, okay, I've gotten here, go to get some supplies or something, and go out to get back in the car. I've just driven there, and the car's still hot, and it goes, and you go, oh no, and you'd have to call somebody in the world of Pond who would come with another car, and they would come with a hauler and haul that away. And everything. But and then a day later, they'd bring it back to me and say, "It's all fixed now." You go, "Yeah, right." So that's why I have such a love of Jaguars. Bob decided to have his secretary, Pat, drive that out here with her husband. And every day, something disastrous happened with that car. So they would have to wait an extra day while it was being repaired. They had just gone over the Hoover Dam, and in the highway going from the Hoover Dam to Vegas, both mufflers fell off. And they stopped and picked them up. They were kind of hot, had to wait for them to cool down and everything, and put them in the back. And then very loudly drove the rest of the way to Vegas. But that was just kind of the way it was. I also had the use of a Jeep that was the most terrifying experience with the car I've ever had, all summer long. You'd shift with it and it would jump sideways. But I survived, so it's okay. Any other questions? Beck?
Which would you prefer, Arlington or Oshkosh for flying?
Well, Oshkosh was just phenomenal. All the years I went to Oshkosh was always an unbelievable experience because 1/10 of all the airplanes in the U.S. were there for that week. And going to Oshkosh, I actually saw full squadrons of P-51 Mustangs flying over and a full squadron of Spitfires. And that's the only place you can see that. So if you guys haven't been, I would highly recommend going to Oshkosh someday.
Thanks for a great talk. Two questions that we always get asked on our tour, almost always. What's the story behind Mitch the Wit, the name?
Okay.
Is that really Dick Parker's wife painted on the P-47?
No. On the P-47, that's a Varga girl, but that is exactly the Varga girl that Dick Parker had painted on the side of one of the numerous airplanes he crashed. And that was actually, I think it's Squirt 4. And Squirt 4 was the one that he was strafing a German train that was in a marshalling yard, and a couple of P-47s had gone ahead of him. And I think the Air Museum has a copy of his gun camera footage. You can see the tracers walking up to the train and starting to hit the train, and then all of a sudden it blows up so big, and he has to fly right through the fireball. As he's flying through the fireball, he's impacted by all kinds of burning railroad car parts. Something came up through the belly of the airplane and took the canopy off. Something hit him in the side of the head and the shoulder. There were holes in the propeller. As he flew out of the fireball, he's looking, and all the leading edges of the wings are scorched, and there's railroad car parts bent around on the leading edges of the wings. He's in a world of hurt. One of his buddies flies up alongside of him, and the radios are still working. Is able to talk him back to an airfield in a friendly area and talk him into a landing. Dick touched down. He said it was the squirreliest landing he ever made. The airplane went up on its nose. Unfortunately, came back down on the gear. The other guy lands in the P-47. Dick's sitting in the P-47 just stunned, hurting, stunned, and everything else. The guy comes running up, helps him out of the airplane. As Dick gets off the airplane and is looking at his airplane, he realizes the reason why it was such a squirrely landing, the tires had been burned off by the fireball in their wheel wells. So he landed on kind of burnt out rubber in the wheels. So it was remarkable he made the landing. He got on the lap of the other guy and they flew back to their airbase. And not too long after that, he was back flying again. And I believe he crashed another P-47 sometime after that. So, we've done a lot of talks on the Tuskegee. That was in the year 2001, and I've gotten to know a lot of the Tuskegee Airmen. And Bob Williams, who was a Tuskegee Airman, he wrote the screenplay that became the HBO movie, The Tuskegee Airmen. He's the one that put me up to that. And it was a several-year process to get to the point where I could actually do it. And the reason why it's in sections is LAX came in on it, so that when we finished it a few months later, we had to ship it into LAX, assemble it there in Terminal 2, and it was there for about a year and a half, and then disassemble it and bring it back and put it on the wall here. But briefly, that's the story about that. Greg reminded me the B-25 and the nose art on it, Mitch the Witch. There really was a Mitch the Witch that flew in World War II in the Pacific. It flew a huge amount of missions. I don't remember exactly how many, but there were a couple of the actual crew members that had come by the museum. So Bob wanted me to paint it up as that, and we actually found photos of the real Mitch the Witch and everything. Somewhere inside that airplane, they signed their names on it. So I don't know where they signed it. Somewhere in that airplane are their signatures. Time passed, things kind of moved out here, and then that paint, the B-25 spent most of its life in Minnesota outside. So it was getting kind of tired. So it was after I painted the mural, we agreed to let me repaint the nose art, and at that point, said, you know, the original nose art really wasn't very good. You know, I had to copy it from photos, and the original, on the original plane overseas, was pretty lousy. So I said, this isn't really Mitch the Witch, so it doesn't have to really be Mitch the Witch. Can I go a little bit nuts with it? And Bob said, sure, go right ahead, just as long as it's pretty. So the Mitch the Witch that's on it now is kind of my concoction of what Mitch the Witch should be, and I tried to get a little bit outlandish with it. But the girl was actually Joan's niece, Bridget. 10 years ago now, before Bridget had a couple of babies. Bridget still looks really good though. And Bridget's sister Melanie is actually on the MiG, so both of them wound up on the MiGs. One last thing. Bob had the Air Museum back there in Minnesota. At one point, I think he had close to 24, 25 airplanes back there. He'd severely outgrown the whole thing. That museum was costing Bob money every month. He was paying the bills on it. They had a decent amount of people coming through, but not enough to pay the bills. There was a group here in Palm Springs of veteran flyers. Harold Williamson, Bill Byrne, Pete Madison. They wanted to build an air museum. All they had was a little office, I think on Indian. And at that point, I knew them. They were trying to bring me into the whole thing. But I was giving their chances of actually pulling off a museum as being very, very slim. Because I'd been around this whole thing long enough to realize it's a really rough thing to be able to do. Bob's introduced to them. And all of a sudden, Bob starts getting ideas. And things, all of a sudden, are swinging into high gear and everything. Because in Bob, he's paying for that museum back there. At one point, he mentioned to me it was costing him $250,000 a quarter to keep that running. Here, I don't know what they eventually worked out, but they were talking about him bringing some of the airplanes out here for season, and they would pay him some rent. So he was thinking, okay, money out of my pocket back there. They're going to pay me here. It's not a very hard decision. And I could see the writing on the wall for a year. I was back there quite a few times. Everybody back there was quite happy with the museum and everything. And Bob went in there. Bob was rigging more and more planes out here every season. And then as it would start to warm up, they would all fly back to Minnesota for summer there. And, you know, back and forth all the time. And actually, that was a lot of fun. But this one Christmas, they were having the Christmas party at the museum there. And when the evening wound down, they were locking the place up. Bob said, and don't bother coming back on Monday because we're moving the whole thing to Palm Springs. And I think Bob was lucky to escape with his life that night. But within 6 months, everything was out here. And he had sold the whole thing there to a Cessna dealership. I think it was Elliott. Does that sound right? So anyway, that's how that happened here. But it made it to where we are here. And we have all these airplanes. And our P-51 Mustang, Bob was gracious enough to actually give it, the title to it, to the Air Museum long before he passed away. And for those of you that don't know, the fuselage has gone to Chino, actually part of it Rialto. The engine is up with Mike Nixon in Tehachapi, who is the guru of Rolls-Royce Maryland engines. He's been restoring those engines for decades. A year from now, we should have the Mustang back here, and it will be all gloriously restored, and it will be flying. And for any of you who ever wanted a Mustang ride, you will be able to pay for a Mustang ride in the Mustang. So start saving your pennies.